Hi, this is your host Apnil Bharti and welcome to TFR Let's Talk. Today we have with us once again Lukas Gentele, CEO of Loft Labs. Lukas, it's great to have you on the show.
Awesome to be here again, Swapnil.
It's my pleasure. And as you're talking before the interview started, the growth of the company. Of course, we are going to talk a lot about the upcoming KubeCon, Cloud Native Con, Loft Lab in this whole ecosystem. But before we go there, just quickly talk a bit about, because also this is end of the year almost, how the company has grown this year. Just give us an update.
Yeah, we've been growing quite a bit. We're almost at 50 people at this point, and as you know, we raised the Series A earlier this year, so that really gave us the capital to invest into the team, invest into the go-to-market and the marketing. And also obviously invest into the product. I think we have a really, great set of features that are coming out recently. We just announced version 4 of the platform, shipping things like externally deployed virtual clusters, where you can, you have your open source virtual clusters, you connect them to the platform pretty seamlessly. And there's a lot more exciting things coming up around KubeCon as well.
Excellent. And yes, we will see each other at KubeCon. We'll talk about all those things. Now let's talk about, if you look at Loft, you folks have been around for a while. And from where I sit, I see that you folks are playing a very key role in this Kubernetes ecosystem. If you look at your projects or if you look at the products, talk a bit about when you started Loft and when you see the company now, what vision you have for the future of Kubernetes multi-tenancy? And if you look at some of your projects, whether it's vCluster or a lot of other projects, how Loft is addressing these challenges?
Yeah, if you would have asked me 2021, before we launched vCluster as an open source project, whether there was like 5 or 6 like Fortune 500 companies already, being commercial customers after just 3 years or so, I probably wouldn't believe you at that point in time. And then seeing that even more people in the open source community are using it, companies of all sizes, right? Some of the biggest companies in the world, down to startups just starting out and onboarding their first customers and running them in virtual clusters in production. I think we're really becoming a really key piece of the Kubernetes puzzle in order for people to really, make the most out of their Kubernetes architecture, architected in a way that is, a lot more efficient than just, creating, 100 clusters and not thinking about, is this the right approach or not? I think we're striking the right balance between having that autonomy and separate clusters versus running it in a very, very efficient and lean way. I definitely, I'm excited we're becoming such an essential piece. And I don't think, 3.5 years ago when we got started, I would have guessed we would be here at this point already.
Thank you. And yeah, it's exciting to see the journey. Now, since we are talking about vCluster, which is one of the many, projects that you folks are working on, and it is getting good, kind of traction in the market as well. Of course, we'll sit down and talk at KubeCon in detail, but can you also talk about what work is going on? It's an open source, so it's all transparent, but still I want to hear from you what new features or updates users can expect in the upcoming release, and once again, what impact these features, because when I look at Loft, you folks work, because it's open source also, it's about what folks want versus what you want, to solve their problem. So talk a bit about how these improvement innovation will also impact the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Yeah, I think there have been 2 very core initiatives that we've been working on, and maybe a third one, if I mentioned that one as well. I think the first one is really creating these integrations for vCluster, because when you have centralized tools running in the underlying cluster, think of it like maybe a cert manager, right? And you want to provision certificates in the virtual cluster. Typically, you'd have to have, essentially a cert manager running in each virtual cluster, or you have to wire it up in a way that the underlying cluster can provision these certificates, but you can still use a certificate resource inside the virtual cluster. So one of the core initiatives we've been working on is writing integrations dedicated for specific tools that we see are very popular in the space. One of the recent ones we've been launching is, for example, KubeVirt. It's a project that picked up a lot of attention, and it's really hard to make that work yourself with vCluster without this integration. So that's a really exciting piece. The other thing we've been working on is, we call that custom resource sync, which essentially allows you to do any resource, connect any resource from the host cluster into the virtual cluster. So if you have something like Cert Manager, for example, and you have it running in the underlying cluster, that certificate resource is now easily addable to your vCluster. You can create it, but the underlying controller is going to take care of it. I think that's another really exciting thing. And then last but not least, that's something we're just about to ship, is the ability to use external data stores to back up your virtual cluster, not just to back them up, but to be the backing store in real time for these virtual clusters. So typically a Kubernetes cluster runs with, etcd, and then with, things like Kine, you can also use things like SQLite as a backing store. But with what we're shipping now is you can have a global RDS cluster, and you give the platform credentials to that global RDS server. And then the platform creates databases for each of your virtual clusters. So each virtual cluster has its own database and its separate user credentials, non-privileged, limited credentials, right? And they're not stored inside the virtual cluster. They're just temporarily accessible by the virtual cluster as it fires up and communicates with the platform. So it's a very secure way to have the state of your virtual cluster live entirely in something like an RDS on AWS, and have it managed and backed up and reliably scalable by a platform like AWS. And people are very good at like scaling and backing up and maintaining relational databases, even in the private cloud. Like companies have been doing that for the past 30 years or so. So I think that creates a lot of confidence in running virtual clusters at scale. I think that's one of the latest initiatives we've been working on that is now shipping.
In addition to vCluster, of course, if you are working on any such thing, you will not share with me right now. You will talk about it when it's ready. But is there any other project which is in the pipeline looking at the problem that the whole Kubernetes ecosystem is facing? Of course, scale can be a problem. Of course, multi-tenancy is a problem. Complexity is a problem. Is there any other issue that you and Loft is working on you can just tease us about?
I think one really exciting thing that will come out at KubeCon is in the direction of, how do you run the platform to manage virtual clusters? Right now we're obviously a very much self-hosted, you run it yourself in your own infra kind of tool. But a lot of companies, tend to make the step towards offering their product in a way as a service. So there may be something coming in that direction.
Thank you for the teaser. Now I'll go back to KubeCon, which is almost around the corner. Can you talk about what are some of the major trends that you're seeing emerging in this Kubernetes cloud native landscape? And how is Loft in position in a way to react and respond to these trends?
I think there are two major trends happening right now. One is definitely the AI wave continues to take up a lot of the headlines, of course, right? And we've been playing a role more at the infra layer for this, much deeper down than the actual, like ChatGPT application kind of layer on top. So that's a world that we're definitely playing in. We were at the AI and high performance compute pre-conference of KubeCon last year and gave a talk there together with CoreWeave. It's a really, really exciting talk for anyone that is curious about how that works. And then the other trend is platform engineering. I'll be giving a keynote at the Platform Engineering Day pre-conference this year at KubeCon in Salt Lake City. So definitely join us for that event. We're going to be sponsored there. Platform engineering, I think, is really important because it is a way to figure out as a company, how do I standardize the way of how do I hand out Kubernetes? How do I secure Kubernetes clusters? how do I make it, easily accessible and usable for my application teams. So in a way, it is about being prescriptive, but also providing certain freedom within the realm of what your guardrails provide within an organization. And defining that, I think, is really, really important. And part of these platform engineering initiatives, I love when they're coupled with FinOps initiatives, because when you look at the FinOps world, right, it's all about how do we optimize our cloud bill, how do we run things as efficiently as possible. And it's a great way to combine that with the standardization efforts that are happening in platform engineering. And as you know, we're fitting right into the middle of this, right? Our whole philosophy about why virtual clusters are becoming such a dominant tool in the CNCF ecosystem is, on the one hand side, we allow engineers to get that autonomy and flexibility of like, hey, you basically get your own Kubernetes cluster. But on the other hand side, it is a very efficient way to do that. So instead of giving you real clusters, you hand out virtual clusters, which are much, much cheaper, much more efficient, right? And I think so we're right in that sweet spot between a lot of these platform engineering standardization initiatives and self-service initiatives, and on the other side, the FinOps initiatives to actually make sure things run as efficiently as possible.
And since we are talking about trends, there's for the last two KubeCon, if I'm not wrong, Gen AI has been the major theme, and I'm assuming that we will see a lot of discussion around, Gen AI. In the previous discussion, we also talked about how Loft Labs is a kind of enabler when it comes to Gen AI workload. Can you also talk about any what is going on from Gen AI or AI? Because even Apple has baked Gen AI into iOS and Siri now.
Right. Yeah. Still waiting to get that upgrade on my phone though. Right. Hopefully that'll ultimately ship to everybody. But no, it's exciting. I think that world of building LLMs, working on AI models in a lot of companies is something that a lot of companies strive to do right now. I'm definitely more on the skeptical side about AI, in the sense that I think there's a lot of marketing happening, there's a lot of over-promising happening, and I think companies are very ambitious in that direction, but they're very much also poking in a lot of directions at the same time, right? I think a lot of the AI work that happens right now is very much research and development heavy, and sometimes looking for the right thing to do rather than exactly knowing this is what we need to build, this is the value it will provide, right? I think it's still important that work is happening, because the promises they are just pretty valuable if you can actually incorporate AI into your products. But it needs to be done in a very careful, not over-promising way. I think there's been all of this talk about AGI, etc., right? And I think that may actually be harmful to the whole wave, because it may disappoint certain people, because we think maybe these humanoid robots are going to run around in 2 years from now, and I'm very skeptical if that will be the actual reality. But yeah, the way we play in this field is obviously people need compute, people need access to Kubernetes. When you look at a lot of these systems today, they are built and trained on Kubernetes. So it is something that you need to enable by handing out Kubernetes to your engineers. At the same time, there's much more of a need to move away from running things on your local machine and getting access to GPUs in the cloud or GPUs on bare metal, right, and running workloads there. And DevPod, as another one of our up and rising open source projects that we launched last year, plays a really important role there by providing these remote cloud-based dev environments that teams and platform teams can hand out to their engineers to do this kind of cutting edge work in the environments that are scalable and provide the kind of hardware that these teams need.
As we're talking about that you folks are kind of pioneer champion when it comes to open source in this cloud native Kubernetes space. Talk a bit about how do you maintain the balance between the open source community contribution, because The community has different needs that may be different from a business, but then businesses have different needs. That's why there are commercial offering that Loft offers. And that is a very successful business model, open source and commercial, not open source versus commercial. Talk a bit about, first of all, how does this approach help Loft help you earn respect, reputation, trust from the community? At the same time, it gives confidence to your customers that working with Loft based on those open source technologies is a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's super important. I think the way we approach it is a very transparent way. I think historically there have been a lot of companies that, had the strategy of pushing open source as much as possible and then layering in commercialization at a later point in time. And I think that creates a lot of friction with the community because, it feels a little bit like a bait and switch sometimes. Even worse if they, may not be able to commercialize as well as they thought they would by layering in their commercial product. And then they feel the need to relicense. I don't think any company who does that, any vendor who does that, takes it lightly. But even if it is a very conscious and absolutely necessary decision in some cases in order for the business to continue to operate and then ultimately support the open source project as well, I think a relicensing that turns you into a closed source project can definitely stir up a lot of things and can be seen as a bait and switch. So I think our philosophy around this is, we started with a commercial offering. We had a commercial offering from day one. And we draw a very clear line around, what goes in open source and what goes into the commercial offering. And I strongly believe there needs to be a lot of value in the open source, and there needs to be yet a lot of value also in the commercial offering. It almost feels like you have twice the amount of work compared to a regular closed source SaaS company, because you've got to create all of this open source value, and then you have to create not just a thin layer of commercial offerings on top. You also have to provide even more value on top in the commercial offering. But if you get it right, and I think we are getting it right, then it is a very fair way to approach the community with it. Because you can say, hey, if you're looking for this amount of value here in the open source, and that is sufficient for you, that is great. But if you're looking for this level of security and scalability, right, and these features that we have in terms of orchestrating your virtual clusters, if you don't just want to run a handful of them, but you want to run hundreds and thousands of them in your, Fortune 500 company, I think it is fair to say that these companies should be evaluating the commercial offering, and they are. And it makes me very happy to see that, right? Because I think it's a very nice way to create sustainable open source. Because, it doesn't really help you if you're at a Fortune 500 company and there's a great open source technology, but in 3 years from now, that company won't be around anymore, or they need to relicense, right? Or any of these things happens. That is actually a very problematic scenario. What is much better is if there's a thriving open source community and it's very clear what is the commercial features on top that are, that require a commercial license key. And if you're one of these enterprises that needs some of these features, you should buy them, right? And that way you ensure that underlying project and the underlying core technology is sustainably secured and developed long-term, right? Because you've seen all of these incidents where individual people maintained open source project, there was not enough funding, right? And just donating once in a while for somebody is just not going to cut it for a core piece of your infrastructure. So we need to find sustainable ways how companies can run open source, support and fund open source, but at the same time, become a valuable business. And I think we're trying to strike that balance in a very transparent way.
Though it's not that troubling, but we are seeing a little bit of trends where some companies are changing business license. We have seen with Velki, the Redis, but the open source community responded quickly. OpenTofu, Velki are a good example. Since you run a company which has not only strong roots in open source, but you also encourage open source, what advice do you have for founders or even VCs? Because most of the companies are VC funded, and Loft, not an exception. So that companies sometimes it's a fear, that with open source, how do we do with the business? So, what is your advice that if somebody is starting a new company, why they should continue to do if they choose that open source is the right path? If they don't want to do it, then they'll start with proprietary in the beginning. There is nothing wrong in proprietary. I use a lot of proprietary technologies, but the problem happens when you build a product and project and you build a big community around it, and then you switch the license, then it does more harm and damage. So what is your advice based on your own experience?
Yeah, I would say start commercial, right? Start with having an open source project and launch your commercial product right away at the same time or really shortly after. It just can't be an afterthought. And while you're iterating on the open source, iterate over the commercial product as well. I think we see them in tandem, right? We typically, like in the earlier days where it was just like, 5 of us instead of 50 as today, right? We had to balance this and we had to say, okay, the next 3 months, we're going to invest, maybe 80% of our work into these commercial features. And then the next quarter, we're going to put 80% of our energy on the open source. Now, obviously, that we're a bigger team, we can, push forward both in parallel. But I think making that an intentional effort to say, I'm not just trying to get as much traction for my open source project, I'm also trying to commercialize from day one. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, there's always going to be, like, if you take 100 people starting with your open source project, probably 90 of them won't even be relevant for your commercial offering. That is totally intentional and completely normal, right? But out of the 10 that you think are in that specific target audience that you think the commercial product is attractive with, see if it is actually attractive for them. And the best way to do that is trying to sell it to them. And if they are not interested, or if they're telling you the open source is good enough, then iterate over that, because that's a problem. And that problem is not going to go away, by essentially just expanding the open source project. There needs to be a value proposition in the commercial product that pushes people, across that line to say, okay, this is really worth investing beyond the time they invest in the open source. It is worth the investment to actually buy this product that is layered on top. And I think that just requires continuous iteration and continuous improvement of that commercial offering. I think that can't be an afterthought that comes like 3 years into the journey. That should be something you should start working on and not just thinking about and strategizing. It should be something you work on literally from day one.
That is a very wise advice, and I'm really happy that I asked that question, and I'm glad that you answered that. Thank you. Now, if you look at future, of course, COVID taught us that don't plan too much in advance. But what kind of role do you see Loft playing in helping organizations achieve cost efficiency? Because we started talking about costs a lot, especially with the growing interest in cost optimization in the Kubernetes environment.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely play a key role there because there's a lot of players that focus on optimizing Kubernetes workloads, but there's very few companies that focus on optimizing Kubernetes itself. And I think that's a valuable complementary solution, right? Cast AI or KubeCost, right? There's a lot of solutions out there that help you cover the application layer on top of your cluster. We help you cover the cluster as well, and you should do both. I think that's a pretty valuable piece. A lot of these FinOps initiatives, I think they are about like tracking cost and charging back cost, but it's starting to become more and more also about like optimizing the infrastructure. And I think that's the world that we're playing in. We're not so much in the world of like chargebacks and like graphics and like analyzing your cost and alerting, but we're much more focused on how do you select the right architecture. And multi-tenancy is a great way to reduce cost. If you can go from 500 clusters to maybe 20, and then you have 500 virtual clusters on top, and you go from 500 platform stack tools to 20, and you can share them now amongst your 500 virtual clusters, there's a lot of value to be gained there, and a lot of cost to be reduced alongside that process.
Lucas, thank you so much for joining me today, and of course, I look forward to seeing you at KubeCon. Thanks for your time today. Thank you.
Yeah, same here. I'll see you.